Yeah, we got a lot to cover, so why don't we just go ahead and get started. So welcome to our first session on building for biodiversity. So this is our first of 4 sessions, and over the next 4 months, we're going to provide kind of a pretty general overview of information on how to plan for biodiversity and how to implement some landscaping practices in your yard that help biodiversity and improve green spaces in your community across all 4 seasons. All right, so Nick, do you want to introduce the Studio HPDC?
Sure. So if you're not familiar, the Studio HPDC is a community classroom where we based in Newton, Mass, and we develop and host training courses for consumers, students, architects, tradespeople, and all experience levels, ranging from introductory sessions to hands-on workshops and certification programs. So if you have an idea for a class, or if you have something you'd like to see developed, or a community education event you'd like to see, you can reach out to us, and we have a board, and we will help develop some new content. So we're always looking for new ideas.
All right.
And this is a photo of the studio, which is part of the Auburndale Builders office, but this is it's a net positive building. So it is a building that makes more energy than it uses. And right now we're looking at putting a roof garden above those solar panels and doing some on-site rainwater collection and putting all these things we're learning from Elise into practice outside.
Awesome. All right, so who are we? So my name is Elise Bernstein. I'm a senior environmental science student at the University of Minnesota. My focus in my coursework is on environmental education and communication. And this educational opportunity has given me some student employment positions as well. I work as a communications assistant at NCM Magazine, and I've had several articles published across various environmental disciplines. And all of those articles that I've had published will be shared with all of you on our the resources document that we're going to share at the end of this presentation. And I also work as an environmental educator at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. So there I do a lot of outreach work, a lot of work with youth to promote pollinator knowledge and pollinator education. And that's where I get a lot of my knowledge on lawn care and taking care of bees and things like that.
And I'm Nick Falkoff. I'm the owner of Auburndale Builders and the co-founder of the studio. And I'm just supporting Elise in this project. She really knows way more than I do.
All right, so here's just a quick, again, a brief little overview of the schedule that we've got planned for the next 4 months. So today we're going to start with just an introduction and talk about some winter practices and spring planning. But before we get started, I wanted to help Nick introduce the scholarship that Auburndale Builders is offering, which is in honor of my grandpa, who was very important to me. We were very close, and he was always very encouraging and very excited to hear about the environmental work that I'm doing.
Yeah, so Stu worked with us we started as a client, and we worked together for over 10 years, and Stu helped my company, and then he helped us to form the classroom and to get it in place and do some fundraising and to develop, really help me visualize how it could work and help build a team around it. And so we're starting an annual scholarship. Stu passed away last year, and we're hoping that we can, if there's students, that want to use it for college or use it for community education or adult education, you can just contact us at this email, and then the board of the studio will review it, and this will be an annual scholarship. And hopefully we can raise money over time and grow that fund.
All right, so here's a quick little agenda for today of what we're going to talk about. So we're going to start with an introduction of some background information. So we're going to talk about what exactly biodiversity is and why it's something we should care about. Then we'll kind of get into some ways to care about, which will just be an overview because we'll be talking about those topics for all of our sessions. And the content that we're presenting today is through the lens of an idea called cues to care, which is a term that's coined by the scientist and environmental educator, Joan Nassauer. So cues to care is meant to describe actions undertaken by humans that indicate a landscape is well cared for and meets cultural expectations for maintenance. So essentially the concept of cues to care explains that natural areas that are sometimes found in more urban areas are highly intentional and they're well cared for and intended to meet the needs of local biodiversity. So once we get done with that little introduction, we're going to talk about some practices that you can implement during the winter time to care for biodiversity, even when it's snowy. Then we'll get into some of the ways that you can plan for spring while it's still winter to get some of those other practices for biodiversity going. If you have questions as we're going along, feel free to throw them in the chat box. I'll probably get to some of them as we go, but we'll make sure to go through all of the questions at the end that haven't been answered. Our session today is going to be recorded and posted on the website, and then we're also going to make a PDF of our slides available, and at the end of the slides there's a document in it that has a ton of resources that talk about some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth. All right, so what is your goal for your landscape? So just put in a few examples here. Maybe you want to make your yard more bird friendly, or maybe you want to reduce fossil fuel emissions in your land care. Maybe you're thinking about reducing noise pollution in your neighborhood. Maybe you want to connect your kids with nature. Maybe you want to have more pollinator friendly space in your yard. We're going to talk about all of these things today and how all of the ways that you can care for biodiversity kind of cater to these goals that you might have for your landscape. So we're going to start with this quote from Doug Tallamy. He's a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, who's pretty much an expert in building for biodiversity. He is the founder of the Homegrown National Parks program and is very passionate about native plants and animals and things like that. So this quote says, the 4 ecological functions that all landscapes need to perform are 1, support a diverse and complex food web. 2, manage local watersheds. 3, move carbon from the atmosphere to the soil. And 4, provide food and housing for as many species of native bees as possible. Lawn does none of these things well, so reducing the area we have in turf grass is a logical first step. So we're going to talk about a bunch of these points that Doug's making today and through the rest of our sessions. So what is biodiversity? When you do a general Google search of biodiversity, you'll probably end up with this definition that says the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So it might seem kind of straightforward, but it's actually a pretty complex term, which was coined in the year 1988 by American biologist E.O. Wilson to kind of come up with a word that's used to describe all of the living organisms on planet Earth. So biodiversity is all of the plants, all of the animals, all of the fungi, all other organisms, which includes humans that live on our planet. And different components of biodiversity make up different ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. So different types of biodiversity make up different kinds of ecosystems. There's aquatic ecosystems, there's ecosystems that exist in rainforests. The ecosystems and biodiversity that we see here at my home in Minnesota are different from what Nick experiences in Massachusetts. All right, so to make this concept a little bit easier to understand, let's take a look at it from the human perspective. So as humans, we live in a built environment. We create all of our own habitats through building, whether we're creating homes, schools, workplaces, or communities. We're using resources from the earth to create our own sort of habitats that shield us from the outdoors. And these systems are reliant on many different complex interdependent parts of the human experience. And it's important to remember that we live in a built environment because as humans and as Americans, we spend approximately 90% of our time indoors. So our relationship with the natural world is very different from that of plants and other animals. So because we live in a built environment, our ecosystems are our schools, our communities, our workplaces, or even our families. We're still part of the animal kingdom, but like I said, we live in a built environment. We're a little bit isolated from the rest of the natural world. So any community, any school or workplace or even family is composed of different people that have different backgrounds, different ethnicities, interests, and strengths. And it's these different components that make up the different ecosystems of the human race. You know, one workplace is one example of a human ecosystem, since we have a different form of communicating and interacting than other elements of biodiversity might. So from the perspective of non-human organisms, it may be easier for us to understand biodiversity from the human perspective. It's important to remember that we are still part of biodiversity. We are still animals. We're still part of the natural world. And biodiversity, when I'm talking about plants and animals, they have similar actions to or interactions to the way that humans interact, but it's much more complex and we can't quite see those interactions that are constantly happening the way you can see two people talking to each other. So for some context to get an idea of how big biodiversity actually is, National Geographic estimates that there are roughly 9 million different species on planet Earth right now. And this is just one estimate. I've seen estimates from other scientists that speculate that there might be as many as 100 million species, and other estimates that say it's less than 9 million. Ultimately, we don't know. We're not sure how many species we have on our planet right now, just because it's such a big concept. So components of biodiversity include plants, animals, fungi, insects, the soil, microbes, things that are too small for us to even see. All of those things make up biodiversity on all of these different species that we have on planet Earth. So these organisms are interacting with each other in ways that we're not necessarily able to see. So why should we care about biodiversity? Why is this something that's important to us? So without biodiversity, there's actually nothing to support life on Earth. Let's talk about why. So unfortunately, biodiversity is something that is rapidly decreasing. In just the year 2020, we lost over 100 different types of species. And this image on the screen here, I took out of a Scientific American article that talks in depth, and it provides a list of all of those species that we lost in 2020, which I've included in the resources page. But 100 species in 1 year is kind of it's a lot to lose. So modern ways of life have really disconnected us as humans from biodiversity and the natural world. As we've said before, we live in a built environment. We're not necessarily in touch with nature or the things that biodiversity provides for us because we don't really see those things happening. 90% of our time is spent indoors. It's easy for us to forget that we are also part of the biodiverse web of ecosystems that exist on planet Earth. Another way that I feel like this connects a little bit more easily with us as humans is to think about species that are considered rare or on the verge of extinction. At one point, those species were abundant and plentiful. There were a lot of them, but it's really our human actions that have kind of driven a lot of these species to the verge of extinction. And it's hard for us to see that because of the way we live in our built environment. So what are the specific benefits of biodiversity? The first one, which I think is really important and gets a lot of people talking, but biodiversity gives us fruitful agricultural practices. Biodiversity gives us a variety of foods that we love to eat, which we have because of pollinators. Biodiversity gives us pollinators. They are responsible for our food. So protecting pollinators helps protect our food supply. The pollinators are actually responsible for 1 in every 3 bites of food for pretty much any food that you eat. So next time you go out to a restaurant or you make dinner, when you're sitting there eating, count 1, 2, 3, and on your 3rd bite, you can thank a pollinator for that bite of food that you just had. So biodiversity also helps to improve the soil quality, which gives us better quality food and more sustainable farming in the long term. So biodiversity also helps to conserve and protect local watersheds. So a variety of species found in the water helps to dissolve excess nutrients or break down pollutants and remove other pathogens that might be found in the water. So this helps the water in our watersheds stay clean and dependable for drinking water, and it also makes it a safer place for other organisms to live. So biodiversity also helps to break down pollutants in our atmosphere and our environment. So the image that I've included on this slide shows the global carbon cycle. If you take a look, there's some plants included in there, like trees in the soil, which are known as, so they pull carbon out of the atmosphere, which is known as carbon sequestration. And these are just two plants, two examples of that are able to take these pollutants out of the atmosphere and make our environment more livable. So we'll come back and talk about this topic specifically in some of our future sessions and just the kind of plants and other things that are responsible for breaking down pollutants in our environment. So biodiversity has a lot of benefits, many that reach far beyond just plants, animals, and fungi. Natural spaces have a lot of benefits for human beings as well. So there's a myriad of benefits to human health specifically that are related to spending time in nature or with access to a green space. When you think about it, for 99% of human history, humans lived either side by side or right in nature. So we were a lot more accustomed to having those interactions with the natural world, but now that we live in this built environment, we've kind of become isolated from that and don't necessarily regularly interact with the benefits that biodiversity has to our health. So the first thing, plain and simple, the natural world is beautiful, and we should appreciate it just for the fact that it exists the way it exists. So these are a couple of pictures I've taken from hiking trips in the last few years. The one on the left is from a trip to Colorado, and then the one on the right is from a trip in northern Minnesota. But it's really just breathtaking and pretty relaxing, honestly, to be able to look at the things that the earth just creates and to be able to see that stuff. So time spent in nature has many benefits to mental health. So protecting biodiversity in the world and in your yard at home is important for local plants and animals, but it also has a lot of benefits to your mental health. Time spent in nature increases overall happiness and well-being. It can decrease levels of stress and anxiety. In Japan, there's a practice called forest bathing, where people are essentially like immersed into a forest. They're immersed in nature, and the practice exists to help improve mental health for people and reduce their stress levels. People who have a view of a natural space at their workplace are actually more likely to be more productive. So this is a picture of one of my workplaces, the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. The office area and our research spaces are really fantastic. They're full of a lot of big windows, and there's easy access to a garden. Right when you go out the front door, we've got a pollinator garden. There's a bunch of open green space right out there. So a lot of these benefits that I'm talking about to human health come from an article called "This Is No Way to Be Human" by Alan Lightman, which I've also included in our resources document. It's very interesting, and I definitely recommend taking a look at that. So what about your kids? Children that are able to spend time in nature on a regular basis actually have higher attention spans. So this idea comes from the author Richard Louv. I've included a picture of his book on this page. But this book, Last Child in the Woods, coins the term nature deficit disorder, which describes how children spend less time outside now than they used to, which Louv argues leads to a variety of behavioral problems. And spending time in nature can increase attention spans and decrease some of those behavioral problems in children. So if you're curious about this, Last Child in the Woods gives a lot of really good examples of how nature is so important to children. So urban areas with more trees actually experience lower crime rates. According to the University of Washington, public housing residents with nearby trees and natural landscapes reported 25% fewer acts of domestic aggression and violence. This same study found that public housing buildings with greater amounts of vegetation had 52% fewer total crimes, 48% fewer property crimes, and 56% fewer violent crimes than buildings with low amounts of vegetation. So the human benefits that come from biodiversity are massive. They spill over into the community and the way that people interact with one another. So what can we do to protect biodiversity in our own yards and communities? Right now, we're just going to go through a quick overview of some of these practices for protecting biodiversity in your yard, in your community. And we'll come back to a lot of these things in our future sessions in a lot more depth, since there's so many things that you can do to interact with biodiversity at home. All right, so the first concept is to care for your yard the way that you care for your home. So you keep your home safe for your children and for your pets and for the rest of your family members. So you can keep your yard safe for your children and your pets, but also for biodiversity. One way that I like to think about this is if you wouldn't use a chemical like a pesticide or an herbicide inside your home, why would you choose to use it on your lawn? So this one's easy to understand. Less is more when you're caring for biodiversity. So by this, we mean doing less work, less weeding, less mowing, less fertilizing, less pesticide use. Eliminating these practices actually allows for biodiversity to thrive. So the images that I have on the screen kind of show exactly what your yard could look like if you were to just let things go. And I know it's not necessarily the traditional look of what people think of for a lawn, but as we referenced in that Doug Tallamy quote at the beginning, the traditional lawn does not cater to biodiversity. It does not provide homes to native bees and things like that. So again, the traditional lawn does not cater to biodiversity. For decades, lawns have just made up or have been made up of like simple turf grass. There's no native species, no flowering plants. This image is a great example of that. It's just grass. There's no food for pollinators or birds or other species, and no sort of habitat included for them either. And regular mowing of a lawn like this deters the growth of any sort of native plant that could come up and be a food source for pollinators. So plant native species that cater to pollinators and other local animals. Native plants provide the best food sources for local pollinators. Many species of pollinators, like a lot of bumblebees and monarch butterflies, are either threatened with extinction or endangered. So increasing their food supply can really help pull these populations back. Not only do native plants give food to these insects, they also can provide habitats as well. So with planting natives, you want to be planting stuff that's blooming across all seasons. So you want to have some plants that are blooming in the spring, some that are blooming in the summer, and some that are blooming in the fall, in order to give pollinators a food supply that lasts the whole season. So these are some images of the pollinator garden that my mom has planted in our front yard at home in Minnesota. So another thing that's easy to do is to reduce mowing frequency. Mowing eliminates the growth of any potential beneficial flowering plants, which most humans typically think of as weeds. So these are plants like dandelions or any sort of like creeping violet that might start growing in your yard. And most humans think of these as unsightly, and that's one of the reasons why we mow so frequently, is to keep our grass short, to keep all weeds out, even though those weeds and other plants that might grow are so important to the health of pollinators. Going along with reducing mowing frequency, another thing you can do is prepare for no mow May, which we'll get into it here in just a minute. So this is an example of something that you can do within your community, and we're going to talk a little bit more about advocacy work in the future. But in communities where lawnmowers are used in multiple places, regular cleaning of equipment should occur. So for landscaping companies or for the city landscapers that are using the same lawnmower, in multiple parts of the city, they should be stopping to clean these lawnmowers, because without cleaning them, you're risking the spread of invasive species, which are very harmful to native ecosystems and native plants and animals. So another thing you can do to protect biodiversity, if you're ready to go all in, is consider planting a bee lawn. So lawns are typically desired because they're short, the plants are small, so it creates an area for recreation. So your kids and your pets are able to run around out there and enjoy their time outside. So a bee lawn still offers this. It's a mixture of short grasses like what we see in the traditional lawn, but it also has some small short blooming plants mixed in there. So in Minnesota, our bee lawns typically have clover and creeping violet in them because those are native plants here. So a bee lawn is great because it still allows for your lawn to remain short, so you still have that area of recreation, but it provides more food to pollinators. So another important thing to do is to avoid using pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and fertilizers. So these are very harmful to the biodiversity in your yard. They may target one thing, but they may end up harming something else at the same time. And not only do pesticides harm the immediate biodiversity that may be around, they can also run off and cause larger issues in local water supplies and contaminate the larger ecosystem. So this image here gives a pretty good example of that. If you look at all the places where it says runoff, it shows where pesticides are able to escape from your yard and actually make it into local water supplies. All right, so another thing that you can do is designate certain areas of your yard to rewild. So rewilding is a concept that was actually generated by conservationists and is usually used in very large conservation settings. So it's essentially the idea of letting nature take care of itself. So in a large conservation setting, scientists will kind of take a step back and just let nature take care of itself. Whatever's growing there, whatever's existing in a certain area, that's what's meant to be there, and they just let that be. So we can apply that same concept to our yards. These are some images from what Nick has done in his backyard, but all you have to do is rope off an area, and whatever grows there, and you just let it be. So this creates great habitat for bees, birds, and any other sort of local animals to your ecosystem. All right, so another thing that you can do for biodiversity is consider removing invasive species. So invasive species are harmful to native wildlife since they can take away resources from the native species and cause a lot larger problems for the greater ecosystem. So some invasive species that you might be familiar with are the Norway maple, buckthorn, and the Bradford pear. And mass.gov has a full list of invasive species and invasive plants specifically that you can keep an eye out for. All right, so let's talk about some ways to practice caring for biodiversity during the winter time. So I know at home in Minnesota, we've gotten a lot of snow the last few days. It's been a pretty cold winter. So in my mind, automatically, I don't really assume that there's a lot you can be doing for biodiversity in the wintertime. But there actually is a lot more than you think. And some of that comes with the way you care for, or you're removing snow. And then some of that comes from the way that you are planning for spring. So immediately, the first thought that I had with winter was snow removal and taking care of ice in your yard. So the three tools, or I guess the three essential tools that you might need in winter are either a snow blower, a shovel, and some road salt. All right, so just as you can electrify your home with a solar panel, you can electrify your landscape. And just like an electric vehicle, the transition to all electric will be gradual. So Nick just bought a electric snowblower. You can go ahead and chime in about how that experience has been.
Quick tool review, I will say the Ryobi, the mid-size electric snowblower. I would recommend it for homeowners with small paved driveways or walkways. You need to buy some batteries. It's nice and lightweight, but if you have any gravel or anything like that, this would not be good. And if you have a huge driveway, recharging the batteries would take you time. But if you have like a small, medium-sized driveway, I think they're a good tool. We're really trying them out because we want to set ourselves up for all electric yard maintenance for my house, and then encourage clients to do the same. So once you buy the batteries for the snowblower, they'll work with a lawnmower, they'll work with your chainsaw, they'll work with your weed whacker, all those things.
So if you don't use a snowblower, a shovel is actually a biodiversity friendly alternative to snow removal. But I know that this is not something that everybody is able to do. Snow is heavy, snow is hard to move by hand. But if you are able to remove snow manually, this creates the least risk to biodiversity because there's no risk of runoff from a gas-powered snowblower, and there's even less noise than what's generated by an electric snowblower. So what about salt? If it's possible, you want to use your road salt sparingly. Road salt's pretty important in a lot of instances because we want to keep ourselves and our cars safe from slipping. But sometimes it has to be used. But we also have to keep in mind that road salt contains a lot of chemicals that can be harmful to wildlife and our local water systems. So if you must use salt to control your ice, try to use it sparingly. Just a handful of salt for every square meter is typically plenty. And if you're looking for a more environmentally friendly alternative, beet juice can also work to melt ice. So winter is actually a great time for identification and removal of invasive species. So as we mentioned, some of the invasive species that you might be familiar with are the Norway maple, the buckthorn, and the Bradford pear. And winter is actually the best time to have any of these invasive species removed. So there's a lot of reasons for this, but first, which is I think the easiest way to convince people of this, it costs way less to have a tree removed in the wintertime. It's a lot less expensive for you, and it's easier for the company for the tree removal company as well. So it's also more convenient to the tree experts or removal companies because the trees have lost all their leaves during the wintertime. So it allows them better access to the tree structure and the limbs for a more safe removal. During the winter, there's also no risk of damaging your garden or your flowers since the flowers aren't blooming at that time of year. The ground is also hard and frozen, so there's less risk of damaging your yard with the heavy machinery that has to be used for tree removal. The biggest one, in my opinion, in terms of protecting biodiversity and why you should remove your trees in the winter is that there's pretty much no risk of spreading disease when you remove a tree in the wintertime. So insects and fungi carry a lot of the diseases that can impact trees really negatively, like the emerald ash borer, for example. And those insects and fungi are dormant in the winter, so there is no risk of those diseases spreading from one to the other. And you can determine if you have any of these species or any any invasive species using the I Naturalist app. So recently, Studio HPDC had some Norway maples removed. So Nick, if you want to say a few things about how that process was.
Yes, so I'm just obviously learning about all this now. And so realizing that the trees in the yard, the Norway maples in our parking lot are invasive, and that, I started reading some of Doug Tallamy's stuff that basically those Norway maples are essentially like a food desert for the local insects that would attract birds. And so we're removing those to plant something that will support the local food network. So yeah, and so I took them down at home, and I'm starting to recognize the Norway maples everywhere. They do store carbon well, and some insects will eat them, but in general, Elise will carry on, they're really not a good plant for, they're also allelopathic. They send out things in their roots that prevent other things from growing. So yeah, so we just took that one down and another one at home, and if people have them, they're definitely, I was protecting the one at home. I didn't realize how bad it was. I thought it was like this beautiful old tree. And then I'm like, oh, this tree is damaging the local ecosystem. So.
Yeah, so why are Norway maples so harmful? They are pretty commonly seen, from what it sounds like, in Massachusetts. They're pretty commonly seen here in Minnesota as well. But just as Nick said, they're like a food desert. They don't provide the same quality or kind of food for insects and other wildlife that native species do. So in this quote from Doug Tallamy, invasive species on average provide 68% less food for insects than natives do. So Norway maples specifically are known to displace other native plants because they have really shallow root systems. They have really large overhanging branches that can steal moisture and light from other plants. They have an extended leaf phenology, which allows for a longer growing period than other native species. They're taking up those resources in the soil for a lot longer. I took a dendrology class last fall, and my professor made sure he drilled it into our minds that Norway maples have the potential to be an ecological nightmare. So now that we've given just a brief overview of some of the things that you can do during the winter time to protect biodiversity, let's talk about some of the ways you can plan for spring while there's still snow on the ground. So first thing we want to do is prepare for No Mow May, which is one of the first things you want to do because it takes place in May, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Don't mow your lawn during the month of May. So May is typically the first warm month of the spring season. So this is the time of year when any flowers will start to bloom, dandelions will start to pop up. And these are the first signs of food for pollinators. And mowing too early risks destroying them, which leaves pollinators without an early source of food. Many bees actually lay their eggs at the end of the fall, and then those pollinators that are in those eggs will actually emerge in the spring. And in the life cycle of a bumblebee, the queen is the only one that survives the winter season, and she's about 6 feet underground, and she'll usually come out during that springtime. So if you're mowing too early, you're risking harming the queen bumblebee as well. So going along with No Mow May, you also want to refrain from cleaning up your yard too early. So like if you had any leaves left over from the fall or anything like that that you want to remove, you want to wait till May is over to start doing some of that stuff. So during the winter time, you want to think of your yard as your very own research station. So this is your own personal space to kind of examine and understand and get in touch with the biodiversity that you have in your yard and in your community and in your neighborhood. So you can take a look for birds or any plants that start growing in your yard, or pollinators that you're seeing around. And you want to be keeping track of these things because they'll help you plan for what you potentially want to plant in the later seasons. So you can use I Naturalist in the spring to determine what species you have in your yard. So what is I Naturalist? I know I've mentioned this about a million times so far, so let's talk about what it actually is. I Naturalist is a super awesome app that you can download on your phone. You can also use it on your computer, but I find it a little bit easier on your phone. And it exists to upload observations, but it's also a really helpful tool that you can use to identify plants, animals, and insect species in your yard. So it gives you identification, but the data that's uploaded to iNaturalist is actually stored in a database and is used by scientists and local researchers. So my colleagues at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab might use the data that's recorded into iNaturalist to monitor bee populations. Scientists that are looking at trees might take a look at how the ash trees are doing based on the number of observations of ash trees that they're having through iNaturalist. So this is known as citizen or community science. So using iNaturalist is super easy. All you have to do is download the app, create an account, click the upload button where you can put in your image. There's a box that'll pop up on the screen that says, what did you see? And that's where you're able to figure out exactly what you're looking for. There'll be a lot of images and examples, and you can just pick the one that looks most similar to what you saw. And you also want to include the date that you have made that observation, the coordinates of where you were. And if you're in the app on your phone, I believe it does that for you. And then you can go ahead and submit. So iNaturalist tells you exactly what you saw, and then the data is sent off to the scientists and people that might actually use it. So during the winter, go ahead and start evaluating your landscape. So by this, I mean, should consider, how big is your yard? How much space do you actually have? Are there areas that you might want to consider rewilding, or a corner of your yard where you just want to let stuff grow and see what happens? Do you have areas of your yard that are mostly sunny, or areas that are mostly shady? How do you have to be mindful of those things when you're thinking about getting native plants to put in your yard? Do you want to consider planting a bee lawn? What type of birds are you seeing when it's springtime and the birds start to come out? Do you have a tree or a different place where you could put a bird feeder in your yard? And it's also important to think about how much time you have to spend in your garden during the spring, the summer, and the fall in your specific landscape. So just going along with that, it's important to think about a budget during the winter time. You want to think about how much money you might want to spend on native plants. If you want to work with a local landscaper or a gardening group, if you want to take another class that will teach you more about native plants, but it's important to think about how much time and money you want to spend on catering to biodiversity in your yard. All right, so we got just one other thing that you can do in the fall, or in the winter, excuse me, to plan for the spring. But we want to put an emphasis on expanding the benefits of biodiversity beyond just your own yard. Because the benefits of benefits to biodiversity actually increase a lot when there's more space for plants to grow, more areas for animals to interact in multiple green spaces within a community. So as part of your spring planning, maybe you want to consider reaching out to local volunteer organizations that might be willing to assist in planning a community garden, or planting certain native plants in a certain area to add green spaces to your community and other communities as well. Because everybody is deserving of equitable access to outdoor spaces. We're all deserving of those green spaces that can be so beneficial to human mental health and well-being, along with all the plants and animals in your area. All right, so that's everything we have so far for today. I know that was kind of a lot of information, and I went through a lot of it kind of quickly just to kind of give an overview. But we'll take time for questions now. And like I said, there'll be a PDF of these slides on the studio website where you can access this resources document that has a lot more information if you want to take a look at any of this stuff a little bit more in depth.
So Elise, there's a question here that says from Alan Noji, what if rewilding conflicts with removing native species?
I'm wondering if Alan meant to say removing invasive species, because typically you don't want to be removing native species. Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question, where Nick and I have talked about this a little bit, because is a little bit of debate in the environmental world and with conservationists about invasive species, because in certain instances they just become part of the community and that's just what's there. But it takes a really, really long time for native insects and animals to adapt to those invasive species, like as a solid food source. So I guess what I would say in terms of rewilding and conflicting with removing invasive species, if you're looking to rewild an area of your yard, you might want to take a look at it first and say, oh, are there invasives here? Are these flowers invasive? Are these trees invasive? You might want to see if you could have those removed before you chose to rewild that specific area.
And there's another question here. Can you recommend a responsible way to get rid of bittersweet?
I'm not sure. I'm not as familiar with like all of the specific plants that you guys have on the East Coast. I'm more familiar with what we have here too. So that adds a little bit of a barrier as well, but I can look into it and see if we can find any resources that have a good method to get rid of stuff like that.
Yeah, Asiatic bittersweet grows all along the Charles River. It grows all over the place here. It kind of, we will put in the resource link, we can add something. So we're going to be building out the resource document as this series goes along.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's a lot of, I use a lot of garden forums to read about that. So like I had invasive vine, trumpet vine, and it's pretty funny what people post about getting rid of invasive vines. They say nuclear war won't really get rid of these invasive vines, but
I know
you can,
vines in particular are really, really hard to get rid of.
but yes, we'll put that as a question, Audrey, and get back to you on what is a good way to approach bittersweet. What I found with trumpet vine, which is an incredibly voracious invasive vine, is that I had to take it down to the roots, and then every time it sprouted out, I had to keep taking away the sprouts over a few years so that it couldn't send energy back down to the roots. And then eventually the trumpet vine more or less disappeared. But okay, Elise, there's another question. Is compost a good alternative to fertilizer?
Yes, compost is a great alternative to fertilizer. I don't know a ton about like doing the composting yourself, just because like the city where we live collects the compost curbside. So we don't really have to go through that process of creating the compost ourselves. But I'm guessing in terms of things you might not want to compost in a home garden, like for our curbside compost, you can compost your pizza boxes, you can compost your eggshell cartons, you can compost meat. But if you're doing that stuff at your home by yourself at home, it might be easier to focus on just food scraps and a lot of eggshells. Eggshells are really important to getting enough nitrogen in your compost.
Yeah, we should probably research that and post some links. I went to a composting workshop at City Hall a few years ago, and they were saying the commercial composting runs a lot higher heat and temperature and it breaks down more. But in residential, they did not. They said keep any pet waste, like don't put your cat litter in there, don't put anything with oils because it won't break down and it'll also attract some animals to the compost. So, but we will research that, and that's something to post for the next one.
For sure.
It was funny when I was in that composting workshop, the person clearly had been putting their cat waste in. And when the teacher said, you shouldn't do that, they were like, oh, oh yeah, well, too late.
Yeah.
I was also offered compost, which was pretty funny. Somebody said, I live in an apartment. Would you be willing to take my compost? Because I feel bad throwing it out. And I said, I don't know about that, but well, this is the primo stuff. It has avocado seeds. I felt like I was being sold something. I said, thank you, but okay, another question, Elise. What do you think of a clover lawn if we want some area that is lawn-like?
Yes, clover is awesome. The in our resources documents, I have a link to the bee lawn page for the University of Minnesota, and we have a bee lawn here at my parents' house, and it's full of a ton of clover. There's tons of clover, tons of creeping violet. So clover is an awesome, awesome alternative to grass because it gives you those flowering plants that are so great for bees.
Yeah, maybe we should post some links to places to get like bee mix lawns if there are places that sell the seeds for those, because it might not be common.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I might have to have you help me with that, Nick, because I know there's a ton of organizations that do that kind of work here in Minneapolis. Would assume so, or I would assume that there's similar organizations that do that kind of work.
I've never seen it at a garden center, so it'd be good to research it.
Yeah.
Okay, so Alan's posted that some conservationists here object to removing mature Norway maples because of losing the carbon benefits, and they're not that long-lived anyway. So what would you say to that, Elise?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of those things that's very dependent on the circumstances and the area. Because like I said, in certain instances, like the invasive species kind of just establish and they're there. And it takes a really long time for the native animals and insects to adapt to those things, but sometimes they do. So in this case, when there are some benefits to Norway maples, like the carbon benefits, it might not always be the best option to remove them. But when there are when there isn't much else for those plants and animals to, I guess, have access to, when the Norway maples start to like dominate, I think that's when we have a lot more concern and we want to start removing them.
And we did find while we were researching this, there was some people pointing out that they'd grown up in Philadelphia. There was like a scientist who grew up in Philadelphia and said that there were multiple caterpillars that did eat the Norway maples. So I don't think we're saying like just remove all of them, but like, yeah, in our neighborhood or my neighborhood, they're everywhere and they're all over the place. And in Toronto, we were reading too, right? It was like considered pretty invasive in Toronto as well. So, but yes, there's definitely a carbon benefit. So they do store carbon. They're not entirely bad, but if we think about long-term, the life of a Norway maple, the one in my yard has got to be at least 50 or 60 years old.
Yeah.
And I also noticed that it does reseed continuously. It puts out tons of seeds, and if unchecked, it would take away, it would, overrun the area.
Yeah, they can become, there's one on the St. Paul campus at the University of Minnesota that is massive. It is a ginormous tree. And from pretty much where its leaves come down for at least like, I'd say like 5 to 10 feet on either side of it, there's nothing else growing because they have that. They make it really hard for other plants to grow near them as well, which is another reason why they're a harmful invasive.
One thing to the benefit of Norway maples, though, is that they will grow anywhere. They'll grow on a sidewalk. They don't need any water. So like they may grow where no other tree will grow. And in those cases, maybe it's not bad having them.
Yeah.
It's better than nothing. They will grow like, yeah, in urban environments really well.
Yeah. There's a lot of invasive species like Norway maples that are kind of like multifaceted issues where there are a lot of benefits to removing them, but you also kind of have to stop and think about it for a minute, like why they were brought here in the first place and why or what some of their benefits actually are.
Okay, Elise, I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. We've got a 4-part series. So if people want to unmute themselves or ask any other questions. Otherwise, we're going to be, at least you want to preview what the next session will be about. And if people have something they would like to see or curious about, they can email us as well.
Yeah, for sure. So our next session, we're going to keep going along with the 4 seasons. So we're going to talk about spring practices and planning for summer. So we'll probably get into a little bit more detail about some of the specific types of plants you might want to plant. And I'm also going to talk about the history of the lawn, which I think is super interesting. It kind of gives us a bit of an idea of why we've become so accustomed to those super green manicured lawns and why they're actually not that great. So those are just a couple of things we'll probably touch on in our next session.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and we will see you hopefully at the next session.